The principle of this debate ultimately lies in the development of these underdeveloped nations who are struggling to find their way up here into a stable and prospering economy. So what does an extreme case of a non-free economy look like? Let's put this in the picture of North Korea, who in the past adopted severe self-resilience and self-sustaining policies so that their economy would be simply North Korea and no one else will intervene in their economy. And what has been the effect of this in their economy? The effect of this is that they have no infrastructure right now to propel themselves into the world stage. North Korea right now is an economy that has only a value of a measly 10 billion, whilst its population is 50 million. A big disparity compared to other nations that had the opportunity in order to adopt free market policies. So, what does it look like? What does economies that don't have a free market, what does developing countries look like? Developing countries look like poor, oftentimes poorly regulated, full of untapped potential, but could never truly be harvested because they don't have the infrastructure in order to harvest these resources. They don't have the funds in order to actually allocate the energy that they have in order to take these resources and to their own benefit. And oftentimes their own citizens are so underpaid that they do not have the incentive to stay in their country and actually provide value in their own economy. So when you don't have money and technologies in the first place, you cannot advance. We've seen these in African economies where oftentimes they are full of resources, untapped. They have a population that is so high, but because of conditions like poverty and corruption, they cannot truly tap into these resources. So our side says that the most strategic way for these economies in order to rise up would be for them to go under aggressive free market policies. Because the world is going under globalization anyway, it would only be more beneficial to these economies that they have the fire starter that they need in order to actually propel themselves up into these world stage, where third-party groups or countries are allowed to build in these developing economies, so partly for their own benefit and for the long term the benefit of the individual people who are in these countries. What does this look like? This economy looks like a tandem of government and these businesses, and particularly this looks like an economy that allows these third-party people in order to develop their industries, so that the country may have these three key principles. Technology, such as in our own economy, the build failed because we didn't have the proper technology, capacity, and efficiency in order to handle this large task. And then these economies also don't have the funds in order to allocate the resources needed to pay these individuals who are actually working to build these economies. And in the long-term prospect, they give an opportunity to those who are already marginalized in today's world by giving them a higher sustainable wage, given the fact that these companies are already have an infrastructure that will last in the long term, in comparison to these government programs that have shown to be very negligent in their capacity in order to actually uplift the people. We say that this would create a virtuous cycle in our part because they will help the people get the resources that they need through these industries that they are actively making in this economy. And further that, eventually, this will increase the wages of these individuals, which will continue this perpetual cycle of specialized individuals who can provide further value in this economy. So, okay, Biwa.
So why does it have to be aggressive? It's not like our side is against foreign investment or intervention in its entirety. You also have to explain why this should come at the expense of the domestic market.
Okay, so we have to say that it really has to be aggressive because right now in the status quo, the foreign policies that we have today is simply not up to par in order to actually propel these economies into the forefront of the future. And we have to say that these economies have to be aggressive because right now the infrastructures that the government has isn't enough, and they have to adopt these policies just so that they can increase the quality of they can increase the quantity of these support systems right now in the status quo faster in comparison to a government that has very little foreign policies that would uplift these peoples in the status quo. Did that answer you? Okay. So with all of that out of the way, government is proud to propose. Take total extension.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why, despite having a small population, North Korea, albeit controversial, is still relatively a decent city with a relatively decent GDP per capita is precisely because they actually focused on their domestic market. Not only did they reject all forms of free market policy, but they even went to the extent of closing off their entire border to the rest of the world. That might be a bit extreme and outside this debate, but we think the principle still does stand that people there aren't particularly starving, though they might have certain qualms with democracy and dictatorship. That's beside the point. The previous speaker talked to us about Africa, for instance, and we think that the reason why you have so much hyperinflation, rampant corruption, and poverty is precisely because of the capitalist system that exploited the continent and these particular individuals. The haves and the have-nots, the very Halliburton corporations and other forms of industrial machinery that seek to oppress these particular people because they wanted them to remain a cheap market, ladies and gentlemen. A cheap market who can buy from them and a cheap market who we can actually use as labor. That's precisely what entrenches these particular continents into being cheap, just like what we see with Asia. The next thing they tell us is this idea and assertion about technology. Build, build, build failed because we didn't have access to funds and resources. We reject that premise and we tell you that it failed because of rampant corruption, ladies and gentlemen, that people had. Take a look at our country. It's so beautiful. We have so many resources. It's not as though we're lacking. It's precisely because people choose to exploit the system and actually steal, as opposed to actually being able to make things work. But you might then ask, how will focusing on the domestic market solve corruption if it's so entrenched? Don't you think that having aggressive free market policy puts a check and balance on these particular individuals? We tell you no, because fundamentally at its base, the interests of these particular groups are different, which I am going to tell you later into my substantive. What is this debate about? Firstly, this debate is a value judgment about the interest of developing countries and their particular economy on three levels. A, growth of GDP in the short term. B, a runway for sustainability and independence in the long term. C, access to better and more strategic investment opportunity over time and not getting the low-hanging fruit when you accept any form of negotiation, when you are aggressive with free market policy, which actually sways the leverage on the person who is actually richer. The second is the adoption of aggressive free market policy at its base and on the onset creates an asymmetrical power dynamic that precisely entrenches these particular developing nations further into the state they're in, which does more harm than good. What is our counterfactual? A couple of levels. A, we reject aggressive free market policies that skew the favor for the counterparty or foreign country, in this case probably developed countries like Europe and the US. B, not necessarily gov burden to not have any form of foreign intervention or investment. We particularly don't want these to be just prevalent. C, where do we then draw the line? What is aggressive, what's not aggressive? Previous speaker didn't tell us what that is. Status quo basically, right? Wherein greater than 50% ownership cannot be owned by a foreign entity, for instance. Or labor market regulations that actually provide a triage of priority in order to give domestic individuals jobs, giving Filipinos jobs as opposed to having to cater to people who are of a different nationality from another particular border. This is as opposed to having to be able to cater to these offshore interests which are not particularly the priority. C, not allowing key industries like water, electricity to be owned by foreign entities or multinational corporations. Meaning it's good in status quo that you have telcos with PLDT, water with MWC and Maynilad, telcos with also Globe and Smart, etc. And basically the power grid by virtue of this being Manila Electric Company. What is my argument? Other rebuttal will be integrated. Why do aggressive free market policies likely lead to exploitation in the long run? And why is it in the interest of the state to prevent this from happening? First level of argumentation is in terms of understanding the prioritization of national interest. That is to say, when another country, let's say the United States, comes into the picture, whether this be directly through the government or through multinational corporations, their primary interests are their taxpayers and their people. And the counterfactual, when we're talking about the domestic market and the Filipinos, the Philippine government's priority is basically us, despite there being rampant levels of corruption. We have to understand that these interests are fundamentally mutually exclusive. Why? Because these companies pay taxes to their home country, which means that they have every goal to be able to make as much as they can in order to be able to be profitable. It's a means to an end, ladies and gentlemen. And we tell you that ultimately, they're more likely to prioritize their own interests as opposed to us. But secondly, even if you say, no, they're for profit, they gravitate towards meritocracy, it's a win-win. We tell you their goal is still going to be shareholder value, meaning their target market, their investors, they all probably are offshore, which mean that insofar as they can exploit this cheaper country to make a margin, to make a profit, they are doing a good job. That's precisely why it's in their interest to actually do it. And the third, which is a round-winning impact, is how exactly do you become developed in the first place and not further entrenched in status quo or you become more disenfranchised? The United States became developed through the Industrial Revolution when they actually focused on their domestic manufacturing. The founding fathers and men who built America with Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt all focused on the domestic market and economy to be able to create industries of scale and things that lasted. Automobile manufacturing, industrial manufacturing, railways and enterprises that stood the test of time, stood the test of centuries. For all of these reasons and more, we reject these free market, aggressive policies and cater to the domestic market. Might be harder, but it's better in the long run. We are very proud to open the first step.
choose aggressive free market policies? Three main reasons. The first is that it's just faster, right? Opening opposition said, oh, we choose domestic markets, maybe it might be harder. In fact, it's quite actually impossible for you to only focus on the domestic market. We think that it's probably better than to focus towards the vested interest of yourself outside of the country. The second is that it gives businesses the most power in order to enact and in order for them to distribute wealth more efficiently as opposed to anything that the government may do, cannot compare. I'll further prove that in my own substantive material. And third and lastly, government intervention is precisely what kills economic development. That is precisely why these countries like North Korea, like, Africa, they are still the poorest countries because the government is so entrenched in power and they can't afford or they can't even move towards those free market policies in the first place. So the problem with opening opposition is that they presume that capitalism is this massive problem that entrenches states and countries in destitute poverty. The main problem that I have is that even in their own examples, free market policies in Africa has made the countries richer. Examples of which are in Ghana or are in South Africa, which have a bustling and emerging economy. Actually, it's precisely because they cater to the foreign market as well. And it's quite funny that they mentioned the fact that North Korea is somewhat okay if you're like, if opening opposition is willing to concede the Atlantic side. I mean, come on, right? Average reasonable person. So, I have three main responses to opening opposition, the first speaker. First, they said that it would likely lead to corruption and, the US has priorities of their own that they'll probably cater to more. And the problem I have with that, or two responses to that is, who cares, right? Who cares if the US has a vested interest in their own citizens and their own nation? Obviously that's the case. But the problem with that is that we can still benefit because of the fact that they have their own interests, right? Literally, the US has a vested interest to not be too corrupt with us because they have all of these agreements in the first place. Second, is that domestic market is good and that the Industrial Revolution and all of its consequences have been a better form for humanity. I'll take that later. They said that, because Ford and all of these industries have grown under the US, it's probably going to be okay. The main response to that is, sure, while that may have been true for America in the past, it certainly is not true for the countries, like the developing world right now, right? Like countries in Southeast Asia, as what my Prime Minister said, right? That globalization is such an effective force, why not utilize it to its best and most efficient capabilities? Third and lastly, they said that there is an asymmetrical power dynamic which shows favor for vested companies outside of the market as opposed to their own domestic product. And we don't necessarily think that that is a problem that open opposition claims it to be, right? We think that it's probably going to be better, probably going to be more favorable for these developing countries to actually have the means of amassing wealth first, and then sure, maybe in the far future, they can talk about things like regulation, as is what's said, like Maslow's hierarchy and everything. But before I get into my substantive material though,
the aggressive free market policies that the Middle East took with the US is precisely what led to the US going into these forever wars to entrench these countries because precisely they're rich in natural resources.
Sure, well that may be true, but for the average person in Saudi Arabia or in Oman, they're probably going to live a far better quality of life as opposed to literally a person in Africa or something, right? So, what are my extensions? Two key ideas. The first is that why big businesses promulgate the distribution of wealth better than the government and better than the domestic market, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So the very nature of aggressive free market policies limit the power of government. Why is that better on our side when it's aggressive? Three reasons. The first is that bureaucracy in developing countries curtail development to a large extent. It's just far, far, far slower. The second is that it's uncomparative to say that corruption is prevalent on our side because guess what, even in opening opposition, even in those developing economies, it's still probably going to be corrupt just in different forms, just in different ways. The third is that the standard of living straight up improves at a faster scale when you have these big businesses who can provide jobs, who can provide economic growth. What are the roles of big businesses and why should we choose them? Three main roles. First is that developing companies have the opportunity to snowball lots and lots of specializations, i.e. Singapore, i.e. Malaysia, i.e. the strategy that India uses, something that you cannot get in the domestic market when you only focus on that. These large corporations have made their countries skyrocket in terms of their economies, which ironically enough still can affect positively the domestic market in the first place, right? The second, that either way, capitalism ought to be a positive force in expanding these businesses to have a trickle-down effect. I.e., when we have monopolistic industries, despite the fact that they are monopolistic, they give people lots more jobs and lots more opportunity, as was said in the Saudi Arabia or Middle East example, right? Three, I think it's fair to assume that corruption will become more rampant. Sure, we concede on that part, but that the nature of that corruption will tend to make things better. I don't necessarily see why corruption, at least in the form of aggressive free market policies, is going to be that bad to that extent. Look, we're perfectly fine with discussions of regulation far off in the future, but as of right now, and honestly for the foreseeable future, like 30, 20 years from now, these developing countries need to practice or prioritize their most imminent needs. Secondly, really quickly, why nothing short of aggressive free markets don't do anything for the country. Two reasons why this is true. Number one, as what my partner mentioned, protectionist and isolated economies like North Korea are trash. Meaning, to a certain extent, free markets are a tool which we can use. Prioritizing foreign development, foreign direct investment is something that's inherently or probably something good. And number two, aggressive free markets rock the boat and move it in the fastest and most efficient way. These are the two most important things for these developing countries, developing economies to manage. We think that it's only through these aggressive free market policies that you can have all of these terms of economic growth at the most efficient and quickest way possible. So for all of those reasons, proud to propose.
Yeah.
If we want these countries and companies to be sustainable in the long run, we need to be able to deal with the problem at its core, as opposed to crying to help for the international community and asking other people to solve our problem for us. We recognize that corruption is a reality on both sides of the house, but we think the point in which you allow corruption to happen domestically and be reliant on other actors or entities to spot that for us or help us is precisely when we fail the people and fail the nation and precisely kill nationalism, which we'll talk about in my extension. But before that, several rebuttals against opening government in general. Firstly, in terms of what PM told us, in terms of how do we compete, how do we innovate, how do we be able to do these things if we don't have money? Like my partner told you, it's not necessarily not having money, it's precisely because these systems and people who we vote into power choose to squander that particular money. And the point in which your solution is getting more money overseas is precisely what enables more nepotism and more cronyism to exactly happen when these people now have a larger honeypot to steal from, as opposed to putting fetters in place to prevent them from doing it on a municipality level or on a barangay level and not just giving them more temptation. Secondly, when Jaron told to us, it's gonna be faster, right? Faster. We think, yes, it's going to be faster for these large corporations to further entrench you in poverty, to further entrench you at the point in which you no longer become an attractive market for them. Because we understand what motivates capitalism and profit. And we think that even if these corporations are benevolent, which my partner talked about in the best case of opening government, they're still going to have a bias and a favor. That's exactly why these large corporations like Big Tech and all these Silicon Valley firms want to get developers from Asia, developers from the Middle East, developers from Africa, precisely because it's cheaper. What incentive do they have to really train and upskill these people at the point in which it becomes so expensive to have to employ them, and you won't be able to earn from the margin from your products or services anymore? That's not going to happen. Thirdly, they talked about how globalization is good and we have to be able to cater that. We tell you, yes, globalization is good, but it's not an absolute good. Like what we said, we're fine with free market policies. It just shouldn't be overly aggressive at the point in which you make a trade-off for your domestic market. Fourthly, in terms of its response to my POI, the average person in the Middle East being fine and it's all good. Yes, we tell you that's only true in Dubai. But in terms of these other particular places, they're entrenched in what? In war. For how long? Many, many years. The fact that these countries have gone to war in the guise of accepting these aggressive free market policies is precisely what gives the West the opportunity to entrench them further into conflict because it's cheaper. Like what Ben Wolder said 10 years ago, right? They have to be able to have stake in these oil fields rather than buying them on fair terms from the people. And getting that stake and encroachment is precisely what free market policies support and tolerate. Fifth, in terms of this snowball specializations and opportunities, we think that's a red herring. We can still have that on our side, and we can even better have that when it's coupled with the Department of Education and domestic market actually being able to inculcate those as opposed to these being not maximized. Yes.
So what guarantee do developing economies have on your will to actually develop?
We think that there are going to be challenges and pains in developing, but we think the fear of actually starting because you have someone else to do your problem for you is precisely what led to the shitty situation we have in status quo, where the Philippine manufacturing and agricultural market is non-existent, ladies and gentlemen. We aren't able to have agricultural innovations and developments. The reason why the average farmer is 50 plus and getting older and older is because there is no incentive structure to grow the agricultural economy and have a chance at these particular individuals to thrive for themselves. Other responses will be integrated. What is my extension? Why the adoption of aggressive free market policies kill nationalism, how this is an affront to the duty and interest of the state, and how this ultimately leads to more war and conflict in the long run. The first level is in terms of the domestic taxpayer. As an average person from a developing country like the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, or Indonesia, the point in which you see your hard-earned money going to the pockets of these particular corporations who pay a corporate tax not to our country, but to their home country, is a point in which you see that as government failure. Government failure to provide good access to free healthcare and services that they ought to be doing, which we think is less likely to happen when you have these aggressive free market policies, because these large corporations or governments are going to want to make a return on their investment. That's exactly how it works. That's exactly why they want to be able to send people here to be able to study cheaper. That's why they want to be able to send people here to be able to have access to these particular opportunities. The country now becomes a foreign experimentation bed to be able to see what they can do. That comes at a point when you sacrifice the domestic people and ultimately aren't able to cater to their particular opportunities. Secondly, they never really told us why exactly it has to be aggressive. That's what my LO posited. They haven't particularly answered that. Because on our side, we can have these things too. Sure, it might be slower, but at least it's going to be synergistic. As opposed to what they said, there's going to be corruption and the people in power are just going to be able to steal more. Third is this idea of Africa, right? This contradiction that Jaron had. Because he said that it's going to be faster, but then he rebutted me by saying how, oh, these African countries are particularly poor and it's crappy there. But then to build their case, he said how you also have rich countries there. So we think, what exactly is it, right? Of course, I understand some are poor, some are rich, but we tell you the reason why those who are poor are actually poor is precisely because of these aggressive free market policies. that entrench them in hyperinflation, entrench them in particular systems where they are actually subservient to the West, subservient to Europe, and at their very mercy to actually be altruistic to save them. Ladies and gentlemen, all of these things are an affront to national identity, and it's more likely to be dissent. Dissent against the government, dissent against these corporations, and dissent against foreigners. And for all of these reasons, we are very proud to oppose the motion as before.
Is it recorded? Shucks. Okay, this is gonna be bad. In the status quo, the developing economy is already stagnant and they cannot find the opportunity in order to find themselves in into the levels of an economy that can cater to these individuals who are actively marginalized in the economy. So before I get into my arguments, I would like to address the rebuttals that the DLO has given us. So firstly, corruption. They replied that build, it is inherently, build. The problem here is inherently because that the economy, because of the government is corrupt, that they cannot have any substantial developments because of how this development works. It is this fundamental reason that we say that we have to create that our side of the government would be more strategically better, at least for the lives of the Filipino people, because now these third-party groups are actually more cohesive with their strategies in how to implement these development attempts in our nation. So even if, yes, there is some bias in their attempts into creating these kinds of infrastructures in our countries, we say that it is still substantially better than the fact that in the first place, we cannot build by ourselves because of how corrupt our country is and how lacking we are in fundings. So they also said something about how this is mutually exclusive, that these companies have shared value interests at the very core, and this would overall create cheaper labor. And we say that this premise isn't true. We say that this isn't mutually exclusive because corruption happens in both fronts. The government already provides very little to these people because of how bad their infrastructure is. Okay. So we say even if there is some inherent shareholder value for these developing nations that adopt these policies, overall it would be still better because the infrastructure that these companies have would be substantially better than the government, who is already defined as very corrupt and cannot provide for the citizens. At the very least, even if there is some inherent bias, the quality that they would give would be substantially better, and overall, it would create a snowball effect wherein these jobs will substantially grow in value as time goes on. So, how do you become more developed in the first place? They also stated that the United States focused on their domestic growth as opposed to as opposed to our example of relying on foreign policy. But we say that we reject this premise because this rags to riches claim is ultimately outdated in to comparison to our side, as in our globalized economy, there can't be another United States of America because the United States is no longer the sole proprietor of a functioning economy. We do not rely on this single entity anymore, and ultimately, these individual countries would not have the same opportunity as the United States in order to actually push themselves up. So, not having these, So they also said that not having money isn't necessarily a problem, but it is a system that is squandering these allocations of resources. But we say that we disagree with this premise again because overall, in our side, at least the objectives is aligned and would overall contribute to our side in the long term. So we actually have two structural reasons why we win. Long-term benefit of the citizens. Yes, even if there are cases of corruption from those policies from these policies that claim would be this claim would still be value neutral at the best, since it's already happening at the status quo. So at the very least, these individuals who are already marginalized can have their own platforms and actually to propel themselves up because their opportunities will be far better in these third parties simply because they have better infrastructure, technologies, and etc. etc. And another thing is, at the macro scale, the economy is alive, albeit ownership of third parties. We say that it's better that the economy is alive in this way because at the very core of it, we also need to keep the economy of these nations alive because if we reduce the leverage that they have in order to actually create change in the first place, then overall, they would be stuck in the bottom of the barrel of these economies now because they don't have the opportunity to do anything. And in the micro scale, these individuals will have gradually more opportunities in order to actually get more wages and ultimately create more value in their economies. Because here, take it from China. Before, their labor was so cheap and now they actually became middle class. And we say that this will happen to these economies too if they adopt these aggressive policies because the economy grows. It is not stunted. It will continue to grow and eventually these companies will lose their place and eventually we will have better infrastructure for these individuals who just want to make sustainable living for themselves.
Do you support the Chinese owning majority of stake in water and electricity?
Wait, what was it?
Do you support the Chinese having majority stake in water or electricity?
No, because it isn't necessarily the fact that it's just the Chinese. We say that third parties, so we say in our own groups, they have the opportunity to actually develop these infrastructures in our own groups. So we're saying that it is still Filipino owned. There's still infrastructure for that, and it isn't necessarily hinged on the fact that the Chinese need to invest in us so that we can have these industries. So we think that the core of this problem is ultimately hinged on who has the resources in order to actually allocate. And we believe that yes, even if we don't necessarily agree that the Chinese should have the control over these resources, we still say that it's better on our part because at least we can better cultivate these resources that we can't even cultivate in the first place because we don't have any infrastructure to build upon in the very first place. So, did I answer your question? Okay. So, with all of those and many more, government is proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, side government specifically the previous speaker, want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say that we can truly empower a domestic market through aggressive free market policy, but aren't able to really acknowledge the trade-offs that this is going to cause. The reason why we're having this debate is because resources are scarce, whether these be resources like money and time and labor. The reason why we need to actually have a debate about free market policy is because the developing country cannot do it on its own. But the nuance here, which we told you from our side, was that these things shouldn't be overly aggressive to the point that you stifle nationalism and ultimately the domestic market. Our opening talked about that, but we on closing are specifically going to tell you how exactly we're going to arrive at that, because our opening never really told us how we're going to do that. By virtue of us filling the missing middle analysis, we're going to be able to bridge and actually demonstrate the impacts that our opening talked to you about. Before that, several responses. The first is, the previous speaker talked about how we won't be reliant on a single entity on the UN, like the US. There's competition, it's globalization. Gone are the days where you have a single monolithic entity. But yo guys, let's wake up, right? Our interest rates in the developing world are precisely dictated by the central bank, the Fed, right? What currency are we actually using to trade? Whether you're from Vietnam, whether you're from the Philippines, or you're from Thailand, last time I checked, all our currencies are pegged to what? The US dollar. So, insofar as we support the spirit of globalization and we think that's cool, there are still people in power who have an asymmetrical power dynamic compared to us. Our opening mentioned that, yes, but we think the extension here is the fact that why would any country want to lose leverage? The point in which you adopt aggressive free market policies is the point in which you lose any form of leverage and are no longer able to negotiate. You're no longer able to negotiate between these people because you've already given up everything that you've given in the info slide. Secondly, in terms of what he mentioned about how globalization will be able to do it and be able to do that. We can have many people at stake. But we think the problem still does exist then. Whether it be Americans who are owning telco or the Chinese who are owning maritime resources, we don't think it's strategic to commit yourself to multiple masters at the point in which you sacrifice your own autonomy. And the third is the fatal flaw in terms of answering the POI, right? If they said that we're fine with the Chinese owning majority of stake, if you read the info slide of the motion, their burden is to be able to defend why exactly they're fine with that. Because it's an aggressive free market policy, not a conservative free market policy. We agree with their opening in terms of how they defined it, but we think that the point in which their side is fine with the Chinese doing it is a point in which off flash. But let's take them at their best. We're going to be charitable. If what they meant was, it's not going to be necessarily that they're going to oppress us because they also have business interests, they also have negotiation, it's going to be some sort of fair arrangement. Let's take a look at what's happening in the seas, right? The disputed territories. The reason why they're going to the extent of shipping islands to be able to create runways, the fact that they're able to use their water cannons to oppress our maritime workers and people who are fishing there, goes to show what kind of people they are. So, at the point in which they do control a majority of our interests, whether that be water or electricity or any form of industry, is a point in which I think it might be a poor idea. Now, what is my extension, right? I'm going to mechanize what our opening failed to do. Firstly, what does labor market regulation look like? This looks like priority for domestic workers and the rejection of aliens and foreigners. We think that on their side, the problem with aggressive free market policy is that citizens are robbed an opportunity to be able to work. Because now, their job, which ought to go to them, is now going to somebody else. What are the impacts of deregulating the labor market? A, legitimized and rampant xenophobia and racism, when now these particular people are to an extent justified in being more aggressive against foreigners, legitimizing the hostility that we're already seeing. Case in point, how we see in other countries and war-torn states and refugees who are seeking asylum, these people are particularly trying to go into where? Developing nations who are nice. But the point in which developing nations adopt all of these aggressive free market policies is a point in which you justify the oppression against these disenfranchised individuals and you make it player versus player, and that ultimately does the second impact here. It breeds civil unrest and incitement against the state because now, in your attempt to have this globalized world, you actually create a PvP and a race to the bottom, resource wars, ladies and gentlemen. The second is, what does not being reliant on foreign investment look like? It means not being contingent on FDI to grow your GDP. If you look at the GDP formula, CIGX, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. Meaning, our counterfactual is clear. We want to grow C, we want to grow G, we want to grow S. The point in which their side adopts aggressive free market policy, they become over-reliant on I. Why is it bad? You get wrecked during times of war or economic uncertainty. Not in a lockstep kind of way, but the point in which your state becomes reliant on the economic condition of the West or whoever country is ruling, and that leads to a host of harms. Lastly, why should state-owned enterprises not all be private? Common sense, ladies and gentlemen. It's because of competing interest and mitigation of risk. Yes, the Americans, the Koreans, the Chinese might be nice, but the point in which we give them too much power to vote over things which are basic necessities like food, electricity, water, and medicine is a point in which we give up too much autonomy and we actually undermine the credibility of the nation, the credibility of the state, and for all of these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Because of the fact that resources are scarce, we have to prioritize the most efficient and fastest way in order for these developing economies to grow, to develop, to become developed. So we have this debate because at its core, developing countries and their economies are shit and terrible right now. How do we make them go towards the point at which they are developed, they are good? At its core, side opposition missed the comparative. They missed the solution and they missed the reason to tell us why this, as their case, is good just because our side is bad. So I will structure my whip speech into like three broad things that the other teams have missed. Firstly, I'll talk about opening opposition's lack of actor interest and lack of nuance to developing economies. Second, I'll talk about closing opposition's missing comparative and why that's bad. Thirdly, I'll talk about opening government's lack of impact and lack of analysis. And lastly, I'll talk to you why closing government wins this debate. Firstly, on opening opposition's lack of actor interest. I have four main problems with opening opposition. The first is that they presume that they can solve all of their problems on their own. That their protectionist style of governing is what will lead them in order to become developed. So, lots of responses. They mentioned that our side is going to be even more entrenched in poverty. But no, right? their stance of having their cake and eating it too just does not work, because the synergism they champion leads to them being entrenched in status quo. The reason why that's bad is because we've been in status quo for the past, 30 to 40 years. It is precisely because of their synergistic nature that we have been led to the state where we're at right now, which doesn't lead to that much growth and development, which is relatively the same all throughout a vast period of time, right? So their claim just doesn't work. The second problem is that, hey, the domestic market, the second problem that I have is that they presume that the domestic market can handle all of the growth and development that, OO claims. We just think that that's not true, right? So, there needs to be trade-offs in order for you to grow. You cannot go soft stance on us and say, I mentioned that you guarantee a slow process that works, when, again, that process has gone on for nearly, such a long time that we don't really see that progress at all at its very nature. Thirdly, and lastly, on opening opposition, they said that, it kills nationalism and makes more war, which is actually something that closing opposition also kind of said this falls in line with that too. They said that it's the government's failure when you see a prioritization of foreign actors on the market, which leads to nationalism being killed and all of that bad stuff for the people within that specific country, right? So 3 responses to that. The first is that it's just not true. I think if the standard in which OP wants to use is civilian satisfaction, necessarily people are going to be happier if they are richer at a faster pace. What happens on our side as opposed to them, right? The second, even if you concede on that fact, it's not like foreign investors are going to magically take over and curtail the entire country in and of itself. In fact, even in the Philippines, which let's say is their example, things like nationalism still continue to be there, still continue to be pervasive. Third, in fact, it's when you are poor and disenfranchised, when you don't have the opportunities given to you in these states, in these developing economies, that you have the tendency to migrate and leave the entire country, right? So, on terms of economic interest for for developing economies themselves, opening opposition does not participate. Before I go into closing opposition, go.
But all the backlash we see in terms of foreign policy are precisely when politicians genuflect to China or the US, case in point, the disputed islands or the American bases. How exactly will aggressive free market policies that genuflect to them make people happier on the ground?
It's precisely because of the fact that they're opening up the borders towards all of these countries that will make the markets of your country more attractive. Which actually leads me to closing opposition specific comparative. So I have 3 main problems with closing opposition. First, they said that, you lose any form of leverage that you have in order to make negotiations for these countries. We actually reject the premise of that statement. It's not going to be like the US forcing Japan to enter to this unfair trade agreement that they didn't want, back in the 1500s or something. What's more likely going to happen is the fact that because these economies are going to open up, they'll become more viable, they'll become more attractive for these domestic markets. And in fact, when those countries, these developing economies, now are opened up, they have the power and attraction to actually choose the types of markets that they want to do, right? So it's capitalism at its best, right? The second is that they said that, it legitimizes xenophobia, that it has the justification, or it justifies the oppression of disenfranchisement. Similar problem to opening opposition. We don't think that in and of itself will be true, right? The fact is that more people will probably be more exposed to globalization, which we believe is going to be a far good thing. Better sharing of knowledge, better economy, all of that stuff. Third is that, it mitigates risk, it undermines the credibility of the state. We think that precisely because of the fact that the state is enacting action in order to make it so, in order for it to develop the economy and develop the state, is probably going to be far better on our side of the house, just as a virtue of them being more developed. So why does CG win? We ultimately win because we create better opportunities for the stakeholders, the citizens who cannot uplift themselves because they would have, the citizens who cannot uplift themselves, we give them a better infrastructure in them for them in order to actually be enfranchised, to actually cultivate their skills. And number two, we win in that ultimately it leaves the economy at a better state, rather than one that has lesser opportunities, which is precisely what you get on both sides of the opposition. So for all of those reasons, proud.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's rather odd that the previous speaker accuses us of not having a counterfactual, but at the same breath, he doesn't have an extension, right? At best, a lot of their premises and impacts were contingent on what opening already told you in this debate. We think that the counterfactual, not just what we gave you, but even our opening gave you, was rather clear, right? We told you that foreign investment and intervention is fine, but it shouldn't be aggressive. That's not necessarily soft, because we think in a world where we don't have any foreign intervention, interaction, or investment, of course any country would suffer. Because we recognize the globalized world we live in is continuously going to be even more globalized, but this debate is particularly of strategic interest in terms of where do we get developing countries on average better? At best case, maybe a developed country, or at least on average, empowering the middle class, people on the ground, people who have needs, people who do need jobs. Before that, a few clarifications to the round, right? Firstly, we think that a lot of what we get from closing government was interesting, but largely derivative of their opening. There really was no extension. Check your notes. Secondly, opening opposition was good, but they never really told us how exactly they're going to reach their impacts. They told you grand ideas like nationalism, they told you grand ideas like state interest and innovation, but never really failed to explain how we're going to arrive there if we actually reject aggressive free market policies. But what did my partner tell you? My partner told you how exactly a gravitation towards the average, or maybe even conservative, when these things aren't aggressive, i.e. they're not a priority as opposed to the domestic market, is particularly important. He told you about how people on the ground do need jobs. The fact that in these poor countries you have a lot of unemployment, you have a lot of people living day to day and ultimately don't have enough to eat, is precisely what leads them to be competitive and ultimately aggressive. So the point in which you have an aggressive free market policy that might mean an influx of foreigners coming in, just like what we're seeing with the Chinese with gaming and pogo, is precisely what's going to lead to more hostility against these particular individuals when now it's state sanctioned. The third is that opening government gave us no particular nuance as to why it should be aggressive, and actually was kind of unresponsive to what opening opposition told you, right? But what exactly is the main issue in this debate? My response is against CG and OG will be integrated. The main issue in this debate is, do free market policies have to be aggressive? And where are developing nations and their people better off? With the goal of gravitating towards an empowerment of the middle class, or with the goal of them being a developed country? We need to understand that what closing government talked to us about innovation and globalization was particularly true and good, but we think that the point in which you have an aggressive free market policy is precisely the risk you open up to that developing country. Meaning, yes, we agree. The point in which they become so attractive is a point in which you have this race to be able to export labor to these particular individuals because it's cheap. The point in which you market yourself as so cheap and attractive is a point in which you do get exploited. We tell you, sure, there's a windfall of opportunity for people on the ground when they become employed, but if we tell you, take a look, ladies and gentlemen, in history, taking a look at software developers and engineers in the Middle East or in Africa or in Asia compared to those in Europe on the West, on average, you're going to see lower wages. And not just lower wages, but also stifled opportunity. Meaning, if you can just work remotely here for a multinational corporation, how do you then dream big to be able to go out of your particular continent to strive for that true quote-unquote American or developed dream? That becomes less likely, and these people more likely become entrenched and a victim of their own circumstance when government intervention legitimizes that and perpetuates that. Secondly, even if you get them those particular benefits, it maybe creates just an illusion of effectiveness. Because sure, they might argue, well, these people do get a job as opposed to starving, but we tell you, until when, ladies and gentlemen? The very reason why you have a stark difference between a developed nation and a developing nation lies in where? Manufacturing capacity. Take a look at how in the Philippines, we don't have any big tech. We don't have any AI. We don't have any agricultural manufacturing, which is sad and a shame that the Philippines, someone who actually taught Vietnam, taught Indonesia how to be an export market, is now the biggest importer of rice and wheat in the world, ladies and gentlemen. A point in which they have failed to be able to feed their people, a point in which they failed to compete with the very industry that they actually once were the forefront. When did it happen? That happened when we became too aggressive with our free market policies. A point in which we were too reliant on the state, too reliant on US and foreign intervention to be able to be our big brother, to help us get out of shit, to help us fight the bully, which are corrupt, nepotistic, and cronyist politicians. The point in which we aren't able to coalesce together as a state and be able to hold these very people accountable by creating industries which, sure, they might influence, but at least we have control of, is a point in which we have a victory for the people from these developing nations. So what do we tell you coming from closing opposition, and why did we win this debate compared to all other teams in this round? Firstly, we grounded this not in terms of an actor motion, it's not, but we told you in terms of why it's particularly better for the people experiencing these free market policies, and why it truly is of the interest of the state to prevent it from happening, to keep order together, to help people. The second is in terms of checking the missing middle analysis coming from opening, where we actually told you how exactly these things could be bad and how are they better in terms of the counterfactual. And thirdly, we think we were able to weigh out the benefits in terms of bench weighing, I guess, but also in terms of role fulfillment, because this is BP, yes, back to BP. So for all of these issues and more, the motion has to fall. Opposition bench, but closing takes first. Thanks.